When Darwin wrote Origin of Species, he actually acknowledged that if his theory was true, you should find all these intermediate forms in the fossil record. And he also acknowledged that we didn't see them. But in the 70s or 80s, the field of paleontology sort of had a reckoning. And this was really led by Gould and Eldridge. And they said, look, these predicted transitional forms in the fossil record, by and large, have not been found. Eldridge and Gould came up with this model of punctuated equilibrium, where basically they said that evolution takes place so rapidly in small populations and in short periods of time that there are not sufficient opportunities for the transitional morphology to have the opportunity to be fossilized. I've never found this theory very convincing because it's basically a theory that predicts that you should find no confirming fossil evidence. So I give this analogy. Okay, let's say I've got a VHS tape. I give you this tape and I say that I caught leprechauns on this VHS tape. Now, they're too small and too fast to be seen, but I promise you they're there. Are you going to believe me? You're going to be like, no, I think you're trying to sell me something that isn't good here. When you see evolutionary scientists resorting to these kinds of explanations to explain away data that does not fit their theory, you know their model is not working very well. We're now taking a step back, Brandon, and we're seeing this sort of macro view that over and over and over again, materialists have to resort to very speculative, and I would call improbable and highly unpersuasive models to be able to explain how they can retain their materialistic and or evolutionary model without it being refuted by the data. We just had a conference here in Seattle a couple of weeks ago where we had biologists and engineers at what we call our conference on engineering and living systems. And the idea is basically that engineers understand how to recognize design. They design things for a living. And what they're saying, working with biologists, is that when we apply an engineering method or engineering assumptions to biology, we can actually make better sense of how biology works by starting with the assumption that life was designed and engineered. And they're actually having great success in understanding things like the function for junk DNA, or why the vertebrate limb skeletal pattern is found reused in different organisms, or why glycolysis, this particular pathway that helps build energy molecules in our cells, why that is so ubiquitous across living organisms.
What do you have in mind when you say, hey, I'm skeptical of this Darwinian or neo-Darwinian model, and I'm advocating for intelligent design? Like, specifically, why? What do you see as the problems or limitations here? And what do you see as the actual evidence for intelligent design?
Sure. So let's start maybe with the positive case for design. Is that okay, Brandon? We could get into criticisms of neo-Darwinism, because intelligent design is actually much broader than just biology. Okay. This is why I believe is such a compelling scientific theory, and that it ties together many different fields of science into an overarching theory or model of where information in nature comes from. So the first area that I would say that we see evidence for design is actually in the origin of the universe. We see that there was a beginning to the universe. The Big Bang model shows that, if you sort of rewind the motion of the galaxies and you look at the best cosmological evidence shows that there was a beginning to the universe. Well, that suggests that there is a super powerful cause outside of space and time, which got the universe started. And this need for such a super powerful and intelligent first cause, strongly suggests a purposeful design behind the origin of the universe. And if you get into the scientific details, even some of the cosmological models that scientists use for explaining, how did the universe get started, they require an input of information. And one of the key sort of fundamental premises of intelligent design is that in our experience, information always comes from a mind, from an intelligent being, okay? When we see new information arising in nature, that always shows the need for a mind. So what's another example from physics and cosmology would be the fine-tuning of the universe. The fact that when we look at the laws of nature, they are very precisely crafted, the fundamental laws and concepts of nature, in order to basically generate a universe where life can exist, okay? What are we talking about? We're talking about things like the gravitational constant, the strength of the weak nuclear force or the strong nuclear force. We're talking about sort of the initial conditions of the universe, the initial entropy of the universe, which according to some scientists has to be fine-tuned to within 1 part in 10 raised to the power of 10 to the 123rd power, just to get the initial entry of the universe such that we could have matter clumping into things like galaxies or stars or planets, the value of the cosmological constant, blah, blah, blah. We could keep going. But there are many fundamental laws and constants of universe which are very precisely fine-tuned. And if they were just slightly different, we couldn't get things like matter, or we couldn't get matter clumping into things like galaxies, stars, or planets, or we couldn't have matter forming compounds, or we couldn't have basically a universe where life could exist. So how do you get this extraordinarily precisely fine-tuning? Well, this actually is information. And so we could talk very briefly about information. What is the kind of information which in our experience always come from intelligence? Well, intelligent design theorists have defined this information as what we call complex and specified information, or CSI for short. Roughly speaking, something is complex if it is unlikely, and it is specified if it matches some independent pattern, okay? So, for example, we give the words that are coming out of my mouth right now are generating vibrations of air molecules in the form of sound, okay? Now, these are very, very unlikely patterns of vibrations, so they would be complex, but they also match when you hear these vibrations in your ear, you know that these vibrations match a pattern that you recognize as words from the English language. So you immediately know that these were designed. It is both an unlikely event, these vibrations, that matches a known pattern, namely, the sound of the English language. Another sort of more everyday example would be, think about Mount Rushmore, okay? Or think about going to mountains. Here in Seattle, I live very close to Mount Rainier. Mount Rainier is a very large volcano that's about 50 miles south of where I live. And this mountain has a very, very unlikely shape. Okay, so we would call it a complex shape. When you look at Mount Rainier, it just looks like a normally, sort of shaped mountain. You can easily explain the shape of Mount Rainier through normal geological processes, weathering, erosion, rain, wind, etc. Okay, so we're not going to say that the shape of Mount Rainier was intelligently designed. Yes, it's unlikely, but there's no special pattern that it matches. Okay, but now you go to Mount Rushmore, and everybody knows Mount Rushmore. If you go to Mount Rushmore, you will see a mountain that also has a very unlikely shape, but now there's something else about it that's special. Namely, it matches the shape, the pattern of 4 famous presidents' faces. Okay, so we also have a specification going on there. So we have something that is both complex, unlikely, and specified, matching a pattern. And this is how we detect design. And so now let's apply that to the laws of the universe. Okay, we have these incredibly unlikely and precise values of the fundamental laws and constants of nature, and yet they match the precise values that are necessary to generate a universe where life can exist, a universe that is habitable for life. We literally see CSI, complex and specified information, embedded into the laws of nature. And in our experience, complex and specified information always traces back to a mind or a personal agent. Now let's apply this to biology, okay?
Before we go to biology, can I just, because I'm just anticipating a couple questions that might be arising in the mind of the listener. So if you don't mind, I just want to go first to the question, how do we know that the universe isn't eternal in the past? Because I'm hearing that stated more and more, and usually the reason that's given for that is that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, according to Newton, right? And so I think people look at that and they go, well, if energy can't be created, then the universe is eternal in the past.
Sure. Well, according to the laws of nature, cannot create new matter, okay? But if there is a being or a super powerful first cause that actually created the universe, then clearly that being is capable of creating matter. Okay, so yeah, within the universe, we know that the laws of nature, matter is neither created nor destroyed. That's the first law of thermodynamics. But when it comes to, a being that exists outside the universe, that created the universe, that caused this beginning to the universe, that being might be able, and presumably is able, to create matter and energy. Okay, so the question now becomes, does the universe look like it's eternal? Does the universe look like it had a first cause? And this gets into obviously some fantastic work that William Lane Craig has done, developing the Kalam cosmological argument. and applying it to the initial beginning to the universe and from what we know from modern science. So what we know, the Kalam argument says that anything that begins to exist has a first cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a first cause. Okay, that's the modern sort of William Lane Craig, brilliant guy, formulation of the cosmological argument for a first cause for the universe. Okay, so the question is that second sort of part of the argument, the universe began to exist. Do we see evidence for that? And the answer is yes. The standard cosmological model today among mainstream physicists and cosmologists is the Big Bang model. And that model predicts that the universe had a beginning. Well, what is some of the evidence that they cite? Well, one of the main lines of evidence they will cite is what we call the redshift. Think of the Doppler effect, okay? When an ambulance is coming towards you on the street, as it's coming towards you, there's sort of a high-pitched sound, and as soon as it goes past you, the pitch of the ambulance siren goes down. It turns out that there is a very similar effect with regards to light waves. What it basically is that if a source that is emitting electromagnetic radiation or light, one form of EM radiation, if it is moving away from you, there is a shift to a longer frequency, a longer wavelength, lower frequency. Probably got that backwards there, but it's a longer wavelength form or higher. Longer wavelength form of EM radiation. Okay. Yep. And this is actually observed when we look at galaxies in the universe. It turns out that there is a shift to the red spectrum of light, which is a longer wavelength form of light. That indicates that the galaxies are receding from one another. So if you kind of rewind that motion, all these galaxies are moving away from one another. If you rewind that motion, it reduces back to an initial point in space and time where all the matter was basically condensed into an infinitely dense point in space and time, what Stephen Hawking called the singularity, okay? And that is the beginning of the universe. Now, the Big Bang model made some other very interesting predictions. It predicted that there would be a form of what they call cosmic background radiation that should be sort of this radiation left over from the initial Big Bang to the universe. And this was first discovered, I think, it was in the 60s by some scientists who discovered this microwave background radiation, or it was first confirmed. And then another line of evidence that supports the Big Bang model is what is called the cosmic background radiation. There was an early prediction that if the Big Bang happened, there should be this leftover radiation called the cosmic background radiation from that initial Big Bang event. And this was first discovered in the 1960s by two scientists named Arno Panzias and Robert Wilson. They discovered it first in 1964. But then in the 1990s, NASA put up this satellite called the Cosmic Background Explorer Satellite, or COBE satellite. And it was able to measure the exact sort of frequency of the cosmic background radiation to the very, very precise value that was predicted by the Big Bang model of the universe. Okay, so this was an incredible, very specific prediction that the Big Bang model, and it was confirmed by this NASA satellite that was put up in the 1990s to a very, very precise degree. And at that time, you saw, Time magazine putting out cover stories about, what does science tell us about God? Or you had leading scientists who were working on this project talking about how we have discovered the beginning to the universe. We've discovered evidence for God. Okay, so this is really extraordinary. When they say God, what they mean is God in the classical sense of the prime mover, the first cause that got the universe going. I'm not saying all these people converted to Christianity, but they were discovering the need for a first cause. Basically, the number one part of God's job description is, a being who can get the universe going. Okay, that's like the first line in the job description for God, and that's what we're seeing evidence for: the need for a super powerful first cause outside of space and time that got the universe going. So it's a very, very powerful argument, I believe, for intelligent design.
And can I just add to that, because I'm tracking with you. I think probably the audience is tracking with you. And the very next thing I at least anticipate is but maybe there's other universes that are bubbling and popping prior to this one, or maybe there's a universe. And it's like, my first thing on that would be, maybe isn't a substitute for truth. Maybe isn't an argument. Maybe is just I guess like an escape hatch that you just throw out there, number one. But number two, even in this scenario of a multiverse or sort of like a cyclical model in any type of scenario, as far as I see it. Now, this is a little bit more philosophical, so just bear with me, as this is just a parenthetical, but you still have the problem of something rather than nothing. And so in philosophical language, you still have, so if let's pick any one of the number of universes within the multiverse. Any one of them, we can imagine a scenario where they could not exist, which means that they're contingent and not necessary, right? Like if something could not exist, then it's a contingent thing. But when we're talking about, I don't even know the right language to use here, reality, existence, just anything rather than actual nothing, doesn't that itself demand some cause? And then the very next question is, well, then what caused God? And I say, beautiful. Now we're really down to rock bottom. Something must be eternal. Am I getting this right? In light of anything existing, whether it's a multiverse, whether it's all your universe, in light of anything existing, something must be eternal. Is that, am I getting that right?
100%.
I agree with you 100%, Brandon. So yeah, we've established actually that the universe is not eternal. We can get to the multiverse in just a minute, but the question is exactly the way you put it. Why is there something rather than nothing? Okay. We have no experience with nothing generating something. Okay. So if there's something, which there is, then there had to be something, and that something had a beginning, our universe. There had to be something that came before it. Okay. And so that raises the question, if we want to invoke God, then isn't that a problem? What was the origin of God? Well, first of all, invoking the origin of God, asking the question about the origin of God, it is a very natural question to ask. So I'm not faulting people for asking that question. I think every one of us asked their mom, if you believed in God when you were young, God, mommy, where did God come from? Right. And the answer, of course, is God is eternal. And God has no origin. It's kind of like, a category fallacy to ask about the origin of God. It's like saying, how are there, married bachelors? It's just, God by definition is an eternal being. And then the question becomes, is that a problem? And the answer is no, because every worldview at its base has to have some uncaused cause, some, essentially eternal thing at its very base. All right. And so I remember I read this book by the Oxford chemist Peter Atkins, who's an atheist. And in this book, he was sort of parodying Genesis. And he said, in the beginning, there was a void. And then he said, by chance, there was a fluctuation in the void. And he goes on to sort of parody Genesis. But for him, this is supposed to explain how the universe got started. Well, my question is, if there was really absolute nothing, then why was there a fluctuation in the void? Okay, fluctuations in voids don't happen for they don't happen for no reason. They don't just come out of nowhere. Okay. And in fact, I love John Lennox. I've heard John Lennox talking about, he has challenged his sort of cosmologist friends. When you say that the universe came from nothing, do you mean absolute nothing or do you mean something else? And John has this great story he tells where he was talking to a leading cosmologist where I forget the name and I don't want to misstate it, but where they acknowledged basically that no, when cosmologists say that the universe came from nothing, they're not talking about absolute nothing. They're basically talking about some kind of a space-time quantum field that pre-existed before the universe, where the universe could pop in and out of existence, kind of like quantum particles do today. Okay, so just for the record, a space-time quantum field is not nothing. It's not absolute nothing. It's something. Okay.
I think you're talking about Lawrence Krauss's book, A Universe from Not Nothing, right? But he actually calls it A Universe from Nothing. I think that's what you're referencing.
Yeah, but if you're saying that the universe came from some kind of a quantum foam or a quantum field, that's not nothing. Okay, you've got to account for that quantum field, which is generating things that might somehow become a universe. And that's exactly the same for Peter Atkins. He's got to account for why there was that fluctuation in the void. So the question now is not, is it a problem for the theist that they posit God as their uncaused cause? The question is, whose uncaused cause is most reasonable? Okay. Do we have experience with, fluctuations in voids being uncaused causes? Or do we have experience with, universes coming from truly absolute nothing? And the answer is no. I think the belief in a super powerful being who is intelligent that created the universe, that is actually helping us to explain a lot of other very interesting, curious phenomena we observe, like this incredibly precise fine-tuning of the universe. I think that believing in a supremely intelligent creator as the uncaused cause is a much more intellectually satisfying uncaused cause than the atheist who has to posit, basically their uncaused cause being nothing. Because guess what? Nothing doesn't create something. You don't have an uncaused cause in atheism or materialism that can explain the origin of the universe, whereas the theist does. And so I think that is theism provides a much more satisfying answer to the uncaused cause at the root of these worldviews than atheism does.
Yeah, and can I just add to that, because I do know that there will be some people who will push back against what you just said, and it's divided, right? Like, it's not a monolithic viewpoint, but there will be some people for sure who will say, we're not saying that the universe came from nothing. We're saying that the universe is eternal. We're saying that that energy and matter are eternal. That is the view that some people will hold, but I still think your point stands in the sense that I love simulation theory because I think it's a great reference point to say a bunch of atheistic scientists are beginning to walk down this path of understanding that it really looks like things are simulated.
Yeah.
And I actually love that because it sort of sits right alongside of intelligent design, where it's like, well, tell me more. I mean, I invite anybody to look into simulation theory. I personally love it because it's like, yes, thank you. That's right. And what we're saying, and tell me if I'm getting this right, is your options are basically a complex, intricate, meaning-filled book that requires no explanation, or an author explains the book. A multi-leveled, multicolored video game, if you will, a computer program that has all kinds of specified information inside of it and functionality, and it just is. There just is this game, or there's a programmer who programmed the game.
Mm-hmm.
Or there just is a canvas with the most amazing Rembrandt painting ever on it, and it assembled itself without any intentionality or intelligence. There just is a canvas, and it seems like those are our choices. Is we just have to believe there just is a book, there just is a canvas, there just is a computer game, or we say, well, wait a second, is it like in every other example of those types of things that we see? And at least in any of those three examples, you'd go, yeah, well, I mean, there's probably a Rembrandt, there's probably a Steve Jobs, right? And there's probably a Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. But then why, when it comes to the way more complicated universe, do we not say, yeah, there's probably a God?
You're hitting all the nails on their head here, Brandon. I mean, first of all, for folks who want to say that our universe is eternal, again, I would point them back to the evidence for a beginning that we see from the evidence supporting the Big Bang cosmological model, which is the standard consensus view. Not 100% of people believe it, but is the standard view of how our universe got started. So basically, our universe doesn't look like it was eternal. Mm-hmm. You could still then hide out in maybe the view that, okay, our universe came from some unseen eternal materialistic realm of multiverses or something like that. And if you want to push it back to unobservables like that, that we have no evidence for, you can do that. But you still are not going to account for exactly what you just said, Brandon.
One of my thoughts when we were talking about the multiverse is, doesn't the probability then become even more improbable when you start adding universes? So it's highly unlikely that our universe is started from nothing. But then when you start adding more universes to that.
Well, I mean, my take on that, Alan, is that it becomes less and less parsimonious. Mm-hmm. If you think of Occam's razor, which essentially says, this is a very crude description, but that simpler explanations tend to be the more correct ones. And so the more unobservable universes that you add to your explanation, and the multiverse basically postulates, and your infinite number of unobservable universes, the less parsimonious your model is going to become. So I think that the multiverse is incredibly unparsimonious, especially when, we only have one universe we can observe. That would be the most parsimonious explanation. Some of my friends who are experts in cosmology, one of my closest coworkers is Dr. Bruce Gordon. He's a PhD in philosophy of physics. So he's actually a brilliant guy. Also a very nice guy. You wouldn't expect philosophers of physics to be so, easy to talk to, but Bruce is one of those guys who's got the brains and the very just nice, easy to talk to kind of attitude. But he has explained that when you invoke the multiverse, it actually does not eliminate the need for fine tuning, because many of the mechanisms that cosmologists will apply to try to explain the multiverse, they themselves require fine tuning.
Yeah.
So invoking the multiverse actually doesn't get rid of the need for fine tuning or explain away the fine tuning. It actually requires more fine tuning. So what that means is that no matter what model you take, we're one universe that was designed by an intelligent designer, or, the multiverse, you cannot get away from the need for fine tuning. Even the multiverse itself requires fine tuning to explain how it came to exist. So fine tuning is a big problem that you just can't get away from if you are a materialist or an atheist.
So this is interesting because when I talk to someone like a Hugh Ross, he'll point out, I like the way he puts it. He says, it really looks like someone wanted us to be here, is the way that he puts it. And then if I listen to someone like an Alex O'Connor, and I've had both of these guys on this podcast, Alex will say, man, how much does God not want us to be here? Given how slim the probability that probabilities that make our existence possible, or life possible on planet Earth. Two totally different interpretations of the fine-tuning data. What do you have to say about that?
Sure. Well, look, just to get a universe that has matter requires fine-tuning. Okay. That's like, you don't have to have life if there's matter, but that's a very, very basic prerequisite. But let's talk about that really extraordinary fine-tuning parameter, the initial entropy of the universe that I mentioned earlier. Why is that so important? Well, that fine-tuning parameter is fine-tuned to within 1 power in 10 raised to the power of 10 to the 123rd power, okay? If you were to try to write that number out and you're writing 1,000 zeros a second, you would die trillions and trillions of years before you could finish writing out that number, okay? It kind of blows the other fine-tuning parameters away. But why does that fine-tuning parameter, why is it so important? Well, it has to do with whether or not we can get things like galaxies, stars, and planets, okay? Basically, there are two sort of extreme ways that the matter in our universe could be arranged. Number one, it could be all clumped in one place, okay? Where you basically just get this universe full of giant black holes. You get these huge clumps of matter. The matter is highly clumpy, and you just get a universe of black holes, or maybe one giant black hole. I don't know. Another way that matter could be distributed is that it could be extremely thin and extremely spread out. And matter could be so sparse that you would never form things like galaxies, stars, and planets. It turns out that our universe has sort of this intermediate degree of clumpiness. And that is what allows us to form really interesting configurations of matter, like galaxies, stars, and planets, which of course are prerequisites for anything that's like life as we know it, okay? To get a place for life to actually exist. And that requires an extraordinary degree of fine tuning. Okay, so to the point, it's kind of that old argument going back to the movie Contact. If there isn't life everywhere, it sure seems life a waste of space. Why isn't there more fine tuning so we don't have life everywhere? That's kind of the idea, okay? My response has always been, well, just to get a universe where you even have anything going on requires a lot of fine tuning, okay? So it's still really interesting just to have, that universe at all where there's something interesting going on. But why isn't there more fine tuning to have life everywhere? Well, maybe the purpose of the universe is not necessarily to have life everywhere, okay? And this now gets into some theology. Okay, I'm a Christian, but I believe that when Psalm 19 says that the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim his handiwork, day and night, they pour forth speech. The universe is literally speaking to the amazingness of the one who made it and the amazing power of the creator to keep us humble, all right? To remind us that it's actually not all about us, that he is the great one who made the universe, okay? So this is not some, we're just these egocentric, humans who think the universe was actually made for us. No, the answer, and that's what you often get from people who think, the fine tuning is just all about us, or, if we're the only ones that God made, doesn't that mean that now it's all about us? No, actually, the reason for the vastness of the universe and the amazing huge size and beauty of the universe is to speak to the glory of the one who made it. It's about God, All right. And so maybe we were put here. The universe is fine tuned. You need an extraordinary degree of fine tuning to get one planet with life or to get a lot of planets with life. Okay. Either way, you need a heck of a lot of fine tuning. So the fact that we are here having this conversation, I don't know if we're the only planet with life, by the way. I don't know if God made life elsewhere in the universe. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I just don't know. As a biblical question, I think the Bible doesn't speak to that. And scientifically, we haven't discovered life yet, but we can't rule it out. So I just don't know. But let's just say, for the sake of the argument, that we are the only planet with life. Okay. Well, that right there is an observation that requires explanation, because that alone requires a lot of fine tuning, whether you have one planet or a lot of planets with life. Okay. So we still have to deal with that fact. That's not, the fact that we're the only planet with life. If that's true, we may not like that, but that does not eliminate the need for us to explain fine tuning. But can we explain that in a theological sense? Is there a good reason that doesn't require it to just be all about us? And the answer is yes. And I think the biblical worldview says that the amazing vastness of the universe is there to show us the glory of God and the amazingness of the creator who made it all. So maybe that's the way it is. Like God made this crazy, amazing universe, and he put us here as observers so we could, appreciate his glory. And maybe there's other spiritual beings as well, who are impressed with this crazy, huge, beautiful universe God made. Maybe the angels praise God. I don't know. I mean, I'm speaking right now, obviously, as a Christian. This is not a scientific argument, but this is sort of a theological objection. And I think it has a theological aspect, and we can counter it with some theology. I think there's perfectly interesting and convincing theological reasons, if we were the only beings in the universe that God made, why that might be the case.
Yeah, I think I love that. And it also makes me think about how, I guess, within Alex O'Connor's interpretation of this, it's almost like applying a motive to God without evidence. Like he could have set up the parameters differently, where basically all roads lead to life, but he didn't. He set up the parameters to where 1 in a kajillion, whatever, however long that number is, leads to life. So, what's his motive in doing that? Well, maybe it shows that we're not that special, or there's like a weird way, I think a backwards way of viewing that. But if we're going to enter into the realm of applying motive to God, which, is a speculative endeavor to say the least, then I think you could just as easily look and say, and this is kind of alongside of your point, the vastness, the grandeur of God in light of the vastness and grandeur of the creation, but also the ability for people to glean that from that well and realize the math and of the fine tuning to say, wow, the probability that we're here is very slim. And there's an elegance, there's a precision, there's an intentionality, it seems, that has allowed us to be here. Then what if the motive is to say, you're handcrafted, you're special, you're loved. With a hair's breadth in either direction, you don't exist. Mm-hmm. But in the same way that if someone, takes like 2 primary paint colors together and puts them on a canvas and goes, here, look, I made this for you. It's like, thanks. Maybe your toddler does that and you actually appreciate it. But if someone crafts something that's intricate, beautiful, majestic, elegant, finely tuned, mathematically precise, etc., and then they go, look at this is for you, or view yourself in light of this, I think it speaks to something a little bit different. So I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
can I jump in as a novice? So when we talk about the sciences, and something that I often hear all the scientists saying is, let's go based off of what we can observe, and what do we observe is exactly what you're saying, Brandon, is we observe that the more specificity, the more precision, the more intentionality and purpose that is invested in something, the more valuable it typically is. And so when you look at God creating humans and fine tuning us into his image, I wouldn't infer from that what Alex O'Connor is saying. I would take from that, the opposite view, which is God wants us here so badly and he values us so much that he made us in his image.
Yeah. And he wants us to see all the other ways that it could have gone wrong, but didn't.
Yeah.
Like he's sustaining everything by his power is what I would say. Like
Yeah.
if we looked and we're like, oh, fine tuning isn't a thing. Like you basically just put two atoms together and every single time you get a human being, we'd be like, okay, so what? But I mean, I don't know. That's how I see it. Is like, is God is sort of like the yeah. Anyways, I guess we'll leave it at that. Okay, so
there's also kind of an evolutionary assumption in, I think, that reasoning that God should have
Mm-hmm.
put more life in the universe, and the assumption is that life arises due and only due to natural laws. So if the natural laws were better, then there would be more life. Okay, we need to understand how the fine-tuning argument works and how it interfaces with intelligent design. The fine-tuning of the laws of nature are necessary for life, but they're not sufficient for life to come into existence. And if we get into the biology, we can talk about that more. So in my view, if there is life elsewhere in the universe, it's not there because it evolved by natural processes. It's there because it was intelligently designed. Anywhere, if there's life in the universe, it had to be there because God basically had to have designed it. As a Christian, that's what I believe. And that's what I think the science points to. It requires an intelligent cause. So basically, it might be the case that more fine-tuning actually wouldn't, create life everywhere. It's up to God, basically, where he wants to put life. And if God wanted to put more life throughout the universe, he certainly could do that. He's created a universe that is habitable for life. And maybe God has reasons for why, he didn't create a universe where life just arises naturally. Maybe this is also to show his glory, that something special happens when life comes into existence that isn't just a natural phenomenon, that he intervened and actually did something really cool and special, again, to show off his glory. I think God's glory can be seen in the natural laws he made, but it can also be seen when God intervenes and does something really unique and special. We see that anyway. So I think that we it's a very theological question that's being asked. And I think that we might be living in exactly the universe that God wanted to have, where his glory is shown.
Okay, so we've basically hit on like something as opposed to nothing speaks to some intentionality or some intelligent design. We've hit on the fine tuning. What else would you layer on top of that as part of the positive case for intelligent design?
Yeah, so Brandon, this I think brings us to biology. And as I said earlier, what really matters in intelligent design is where does new information come from? Intelligent design really is a scientific theory about the origin of information. And it's a scientific theory because it can tie together many different fields, biology, but also cosmology and physics. So let's get into some of the biology here and talk about how information is so crucial in biology and how that points also giving us a positive argument for intelligent design. So, and let's just talk about something very, very basic. Where do new proteins come from? Okay, so first of all, let's ask the question, what are proteins? Proteins are basically worker molecules in your cells, and they're basically long chains of amino acids that fold up into very precise shapes in order to perform important biological functions. They could be an enzyme that's catalyzing some reaction. It might be performing some structural role, but proteins are incredibly important. Well, it turns out that the ordering of those amino acids has to be just right in order to get a protein to be able to function properly. We can come back to that in just a second. But what determines the ordering of the amino acids is actually information in your DNA. So what is DNA? DNA, of course, are very famous molecules. They form chromosomes in your cells. And along the backbone of the DNA molecule, if you were to stretch it out, you would see that along the backbone of the DNA molecule are these nucleotide bases. They're kind of strong like rungs in a ladder. There are 4 nucleotide bases that are used in DNA: adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine, often represented by the letters A, T, C, and G. And it's the precise ordering of those A, T, C's, and G's in your DNA that determines the ordering of the amino acids in your proteins, okay? So just how precisely ordered do the amino acids and proteins have to be? Well, my colleague at Discovery Institute, Doug Axe, he's a professor at Biola University now, he has done experiments. They're called mutagenesis experiments on proteins. And he looked at the beta-lactamase enzyme, that's an enzyme in E. coli, and he asked exactly how precisely ordered do the amino acids in the beta-lactamase enzyme have to be in order to give us a protein that can function properly. And he published this research in the Journal of Molecular Biology. And what he found is that in this enzyme, the likelihood of just a chance or random ordering of amino acids giving you a functional protein is less than 1 in 10 to the 77th power. Okay. And beta lactamase is, we could see it as being like an enzyme of fairly typical complexity. So it's representative of the kind of complexity we see very commonly in enzymes. That means that the likelihood of a random sequence of amino acids giving you a functional protein of typical complexity is very, very low. So what this means is that in order to get that rare and very precise ordering of amino acids and proteins, you have to have the nucleotide bases in precisely the right order in the DNA. And this is what we would call complex and specified information. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but again, what we're seeing in the DNA molecule is a very unlikely ordering of nucleotide bases that matches the precise pattern that is necessary to give you a functional protein. This is high levels of complex and specified information in your DNA. And what's interesting, one of the most interesting discoveries that I learned about is that there is no physical or chemical law that dictates the ordering of the nucleotide bases in the DNA, okay? It is true information. It doesn't have to be in the order it is. So the question is, what generates the ordering of the nucleotide bases in the DNA to give you functional proteins? That's the question we have to ask. Where does this high level of complex and specified information come from? And we could see the information in DNA very much being akin to a language-based code. In fact, many scientists, leading scientists, have made the comparison between DNA and language or DNA and software. Why is that? It's because literally what we see in our DNA is it contains instructions and commands that encode, tell the cellular machinery in your cells how to build functional proteins. And I often like to compare DNA to a DVD, okay? If you remember when we used to watch DVDs, if you just have a DVD, the DVD is basically worthless, right? Maybe you could use it as a coaster, or in college, we used to throw DVDs as a Frisbee into this eucalyptus tree near our dorm, get it stuck in the bark, but a DVD by itself is not really good for very much, okay? You need a machine to be able to read the instructions and commands, that language-based code on the DVD, so you can watch that movie or get the output you want. DNA is very much the same. By itself, a DNA molecule is not going to do anything. You also need machinery, and our cells have literally molecular machines in our cells that read the information and can read, interpret, and execute the commands and instructions and this language-based code in the DNA molecule, and then give you the output you want. And what is the output? They're literally building molecular machines, okay? These molecular machines in our cells are literally then constructing other molecular machines. So we have machines building machines, and those molecular machines then can go in the cell and perform all kinds of important cellular functions. In fact, what's interesting is that the DNA molecule contains the instructions for building those machines. It would be kind of like, what if the instructions for building the first DVD player was found on a DVD? Okay, how are you going to build that DVD player without the DVD player? You need it to build itself. And
Okay,
in the
so
same way you need, yeah.
I just want to make sure I'm getting this right. So what is the DVD? What is the first machine, and what is the machine that is being created?
Okay, the DVD is like the DNA molecule. Okay,
the DNA molecule. The machine that reads it is what?
Well, the machine that's reading the information on DNA, there's multiple molecular machines involved with this, but let's just focus on one, the ribosome, okay? The ribosome is the machine that ultimately translates the information from the DNA and then builds proteins, which then form other molecular machines, okay?
Like
including
what would be
the ribosome.
Oh,
Well, the ribosome is one of them, okay? The ribosome is a combination of both protein and RNA, but the ribosome needs proteins that are being translated by other ribosomes, okay? So the ribosome, in a sense, is building itself, okay? So what if the first ribosome was encoded on a DNA molecule? You could not build that ribosome unless you already had a ribosome. Mm-hmm. It's just like having the first DVD player information, is encoded on a DNA molecule. Is encoded on a DVD. You can't build that DVD player unless you can get the instructions off of the DVD, but that's where you need the DVD reader to be able to do that.
Okay, and within that, what exactly does the 1 × 10�77th power describe?
Okay, that is pertaining to the likelihood of getting a sequence of amino acids that yields a functional protein. Okay, if you were just put together a long string of amino acids, what is the likelihood that you would get a protein or enzyme of typical complexity. Okay, there's different kinds of proteins out there. We'll talk about an enzyme that's catalyzing a typical reaction. That's the kind of enzyme that Doug Axe studied. What is the likelihood that a random chance sequence of amino acids would give you a functional protein? And the likelihood is about 1 in 10 to the 77th power. So that's extremely unlikely. That's like, I've heard this analogy. It's like saying that if we look at our galaxy and you look at every atom in the galaxy, that you just kind of, and there's one particular atom that you want to pick. You put a blindfold on and you go to the galaxy and you pick one atom and you get the right atom. Okay, that's the likelihood of getting a functional protein amino acid sequence that yields a functional protein of beta lactamase type complexity. Just getting that by chance.
Okay, and so that's helpful. Analogies are helpful when it comes to big numbers. So are we then saying that probability is happening every single time that a functional protein fold does occur, or are we saying this happens like one time, like when the sperm meets the egg and a new life begins at the zygote, like that probability happens one time? Or are you saying it's happening in all of our bodies all the time, every single day?
What I'm saying is actually it's not improbable, because the information in your DNA guarantees that you will construct proteins that have the right ordering of amino acids, and that allows them to work. And the reason why they are able to work is because the information in your DNA is there. It's like having software in a computer program.
Right.
If you just have a bunch of random, I've written about 30,000 lines of Python code during my PhD. Okay. And I can tell you that if you just put random commands in there, it's not going to work. But when you put the commands in the right order, the program will work. That doesn't happen by chance. That information comes about because a mind has ordered it. Okay. So where I was going with this is we are literally seeing complex and specified information in our DNA. It is a very unlikely arrangement of nucleotide bases that matches the precise ordering we need to get functional proteins with the amino acids in the right orders. And in our experience, complex and specified information only comes from a mind. So the reason why it's guaranteed to work is because it didn't happen by chance. Okay.
But that's what I'm trying to say. So those, but I'm trying to just make it crystal clear. Like, those are our choices. We either believe that 1 times 10 to the 77th scenario is playing out undirected and random, which is like saying we're picking a single, I guess, atom out of the universe. We either believe that, or we believe that there is some program that is directing that correct pick time and time and time again. Or is that a straw man? Like, what if I'm Richard Dawkins and I'm talking to you, what's going to be my counterpoint to what you're saying?
Well, I mean, Dawkins and I think I don't want to speak for Dawkins, but I think we would both agree that there's information in DNA, and that information, the ordering of those nucleotide bases, is what determines the ordering of the amino acids and proteins. And that information is there. I would argue, the question is, how did it get there? Where did the information originally come from? Okay. Once the information is there, yes, our DNA and a fully functional cell can make copies of itself. Okay. That's fine. Dawkins and I both agree on that. And so you're going to just perpetuate this functional information once it's there and it's working. Okay. We all agree on that. So once it's working, the chances that it's going to keep going is pretty good. Okay. But the question is, how did that information get there to begin with? Okay. Dawkins would argue it got there by natural selection. That maybe you started off with a very simple protein and gradually you built up its complexity, okay, until you get this super unlikely protein. I would argue, and I think ID theorists would argue, that to get a functional protein, you need so many amino acids to be in just the right order all at once that there's no way to build it up one little mutational step at a time. Either many amino acids are there in the right order, and again, this just means the information in the DNA is in the right order. Much of that information is already there and present to give you a functional a functional protein, or it's not there and you don't get a functional protein, and basically there's no reason for natural selection to preserve it. Okay, so this kind of a feature cannot be built up one little mutational step at a time, because too much information, too much complexity has to be there all at once, or it doesn't work at all. to give you an advantage in survival and reproduction. Okay. So I don't think that the Darwinian mechanism is going to get you there. Now, we could also talk about the origin of life. This is, assuming an evolution or Darwinian evolutionary context. Before the origin of life, there was no Darwinian evolution. In fact, many people define the origin of life as the origin of replication. Okay. And so if before the origin of replication, all you've got to order those nucleotides is blind chance. You're just imagining that there's some hypothetical scenario. Somehow you've got this primordial sea of all these RNA molecules that are being generated for no apparent reason. And some of them somehow just happen, or one of them maybe just happens to get the nucleotides in the right order to give you, the ability to carry the information needed for generating functional proteins. They have no explanation for this, but in that context, truly all you have is 100% blind chance to get the first self-replicating molecule, which they would define as the origin of life. And again, to get that information, it's incredibly unlikely, to the point that some biologists have argued that it's just impossible. It's just not a model that works.
Well, this kind of leads into what I would consider one of the craziest moments in the history of movies or documentaries, when Richard Dawkins basically said that it's possible that aliens are the source for the information inside, like panspermia, right? He granted that as a possibility, which to me, I'm like, you kind of just gave away the whole farm. If you're cool with that, then what could possibly be your problem with another form of higher off-world intelligence?
Yeah, I'm not sure how Ben Stein got Dawkins to acknowledge that, there could have been intelligent design if it was aliens. But I've always found it very interesting that Dawkins is willing to consider intelligent design, provided that it's not God. Okay. Now, the theory of intelligent design as a science doesn't tell you who the designer is. Okay. All we see is this information-rich code in our DNA. And that, to me, screams out intelligent design. But the designer could be, a natural being, intelligent being from another planet, or it could be a divine being or something else. It doesn't necessarily answer that question. Just looking at the information in DNA doesn't tell us who the designer is. Dawkins is okay with intelligent design, provided that it's an alien, but he doesn't seem okay with it if it's God. But, Brandon, I didn't quite finish the positive case for design for information.
Yes.
Can I just finish
Please.
this real quick?
Yes.
Because, again, just having that information in our DNA is not enough. You need the molecular machinery to interpret that DNA or interpret that information. But where in our experience do things like information-rich language-based code, computer-like information processing, and machine-like structures, where do these kinds of things come from? In all of our experience, they only come from intelligence. And yet that is exactly what we see at the heart of life. We see an information-rich language-based code in our DNA that is then interpreted through a computer-like system of information processing through these molecular machines that read those instructions and commands in the DNA and execute them. And what are they building? They're building molecular machines. But in all of our experience, language-based code, information-rich, software-like systems with computer-like information processing and machines, they only come from intelligence. So we have a very strong positive argument for intelligent design, just looking at the very basic molecular biology that you learn in the 8th or 9th grade biology class makes a compelling argument for design.
Yeah. I mean, so like the syllogism, right? Like, and all of our observable experience, like and information only comes from intelligence, like specified functional complex information comes from intelligence. There is that in the cell. Therefore, like it follows logically that unless you want to pull but maybe, which is not an argument, that's an escape hatch to avoid the direction that the evidence is pointing. Unless you just go, yeah, but maybe, but what if? It's like, if you're just going to follow that logically, you like the premise follows those conclusions. Or sorry, those premises lead to that conclusion.
Yeah.
And the only alternative I've heard of that is coevolution. But I did a whole video on this. I think it was Stephen Woodford from a YouTube channel called Rationality Rules was trying to put forth the argument that coevolution explains away that syllogism because it accounts for the rise of information through sort of like signaling and chemical processes that that work together. I don't know if you have anything to say about that. I think you already did debunk that, honestly, in what you said a couple of minutes ago about how it's a chicken and an egg problem, and you can't really get around that just by sort of positing, sort of hand waving it away with coevolution. But do you have anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, I mean, look, there is evidence that we can fine tune the function of proteins through a Darwinian process. Once you already have the functional protein fold there, and the protein already has the activity you're looking for. So I'm not saying that Darwinian evolution can't do anything, but in order just to get, the basic prerequisite that you need, a functional protein fold, that in of itself requires so many amino acids to be in the right order, so much information to be present in the DNA. You're not going to be able to generate that in the step-by-step manner that's required by, Darwinian evolution. You're not going to be able to get there. It has to be there all at once, or it doesn't work at all. So I just think that Darwinian evolution doesn't do the job. On the coevolution thing, I think that when you talk about the origin of life, okay, so you have a DNA molecule or an RNA molecule. How is it going to make copies of itself? Well, it's going to need molecular machinery to be able to do that, okay? But you have to have the whole system there all at once. You can't just have one part of the system. And that is, again, that's like irreducible complexity on a very, very grand level. Here's an interesting point about this idea that life started off as RNA, and maybe you had a self-replicating RNA molecule that could somehow make copies of itself. They've done studies on, what can you do when you generate lots of RNA molecules randomly? It's far more likely to generate an RNA molecule that basically destroys other RNAs than it is to generate an RNA molecule that will make copies of RNA molecules. So in other words, the RNA world theory, which claims that somehow the first life form was this self-replicating RNA molecule, it's not going to work because you're going to generate RNAs that destroy RNA molecules long before you're going to generate an RNA molecule that can reproduce itself. So they just don't have a model to build the complexity that we see in the simplest cell.
That's super interesting. I would love, by the way, I know I keep putting you on the hook for cross-aisle conversations, but I've in the past couple of weeks been snooping around on TikTok live streams, and there's a lot of atheists and some scientists and people there who maybe even they're like students in biology or whatever the case may be, but who are totally convinced that everything is best explained materialistically. And I just think, man, like if we were to do, I know this is like a pre-recorded podcast, but if we were in the future to ever do a live stream focusing on a specific topic, even like the topic that we're on right now, and then actually like invite people to request to join, kind of like a live radio call in thing, say, is this tracking? Like, what's your objection? And just like let that conversation unfold in that manner. I think it would be really helpful to further the understanding that most people have, because it's one thing for us to say it, but it's like we're talking in this sort of silo, if you will, and then I see all these other people who are saying something different. And I think to be honest, I think you're getting to the point, which is a lot of people are not talking about the origin of the information. They're talking about how the information functions once it's there. That's one of the biggest like areas that I think it's like ships passing in the night. But I would just love to see.
I'm definitely talking about both. Where does the information come from initially, but also how it functions once it's there. The whole system points to intelligent design. But of course, Brandon, I'm very open to having friendly civil conversations. I think that's one of the most important things you can do. So I would love, that's a great idea. I would love to do it. It'd be a lot of fun. Yeah.
Okay, cool. We'll make it happen then. So continuing forward, what else do you want to hit on in the positive case for intelligent design, or do you want to go to some of your issues with neo-Darwin? I'll let you take it whichever direction you want. I don't want to cut you short. I have all the time in the world, but so take it wherever you want.
Sure. So another positive piece of evidence for intelligent design is when we look at the history of life in the fossil record. What we see in the fossil record is a repeated pattern of explosions where new types of organisms appear abruptly in the fossil record without clear, direct evolutionary precursors. And so, for example, the most famous one of these is the Cambrian explosion, where most of the major groups of animals called phyla appear in the fossil record in the Cambrian about 520, 530 million years ago in a very abrupt manner. And this, I think Richard Dawkins said, this is more or less an exact quote, that it's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. I mean, that's really extraordinary. And we see other explosions in the history of life. We see that there is a plant explosion. There's an angiosperm explosion where you see what's been called the big bloom of flowering plants. There's an explosion of different types of fish. There's a bird explosion in the fossil record. There's a mammal explosion in the fossil record. The origin of our own genus Homo, we're the species Homo sapiens, it has been called a Big Bang theory of human evolution because the human-like body plan appears abruptly in the fossil record. So this is a pattern that we see over and over again. And in my view, as an ID theorist, I think what we're seeing is the infusion of very large amounts of information into the biosphere to generate new types of organisms. And that is reflected in the abrupt appearance of these new types of organisms. So again, ID is about the origin of new types of information. And where does information come from? What we see in the fossil record is the same pattern. Very large amounts of information being introduced into the natural world very rapidly. And that shows up as these explosions of new types of life forms in the fossil record. It's a positive argument for intelligent design. We go on and on, but yeah, I think these are some of the main lines of evidence that I would hit.
And what would be the counter explanation for the way that the fossil record looks that would say the cause for that is not what you're saying, but it's Darwin's idea? Or I mean, what would be the counter to that?
Yeah, well, the main one that you hear is what is called punctuated equilibrium, okay? And that is a model that was developed by Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge in the 1970s. Basically, the history of paleontology post-Darwin went something like this, okay? When Darwin wrote Origin of Species, he actually acknowledged that if his theory was true, you should find all these intermediate forms in the fossil record. And he also acknowledged that we didn't see them, okay? But he believed that the fossil record was incomplete and that over time, as paleontologists searched more and more, they would find these intermediate forms. So it took over 100 years, but in the 70s or 80s, the field of paleontology sort of had a reckoning. And this was really led by Gould and Eldredge. And they said, look, these predicted transitional forms in the fossil record, by and large, have not been found. Yeah, there are occasional fossils that might be potential transitional forms. We could talk about those. In fact, a lot of them have issues where they really can't be transitional forms when you drill down into what they actually are. But Eldredge and Gould came up with this model of punctuated equilibrium, where basically they said that evolution takes place so rapidly in small populations and in short periods of time that there are not sufficient opportunities for the transitional morphology to have the opportunity to be fossilized, okay? So basically, evolution happens so rapidly and in such small populations, you don't have opportunities to fossilize the intermediate stages in evolution, okay? So I've never found this theory very convincing because it's basically a theory that predicts that you should find no confirming fossil evidence, okay? Right. So I give this analogy. Let's say, remember when we used to watch VHS tapes, okay? Let's say I've got a VHS tape. Yeah. And I give you this tape and I say, I promise you, Brandon and Alan, that I caught leprechauns on this VHS tape. Now, they're too small and too fast to be seen, but I promise you they're there. Are you going to believe me? You're going to be like, no, I think you're trying to sell me something that isn't good here, okay?
Right.
That's kind of the way I feel about punctual equilibrium. The evolution is always taking place somewhere else or in a place where it couldn't be recorded by the fossil record. I don't find that to be a very compelling theory. There have also been complaints from biologists who say that it's called punk-eek. The punk-eek model requires too much biological change too quickly. And you just can't get that kind of biological change too rapidly. In fact, I don't have the exact quote at my fingertips, but Darwin said in Origin of Species that in order to get the variation that is needed to build new species, you need very large population sizes, because that is where you can have enough opportunities for just by chance for you basically to produce these new forms these new advantageous forms that his theory requires. Okay. Well, punk-eek basically robs Darwin's theory of the probabilistic resources that it needs. It says that the vast majority of the evolution takes place in the vast minority of organisms and in these very small periods of time. So you don't have the time that Darwin's theory needs, and you don't have the large population that Darwin's theory needs to generate this evolutionary novelty. So I think that punk-eek, it's really not a very good solution to the problem of why the fossil record lacks transitional forms. But that's probably the main argument you would get.
Okay, so and just to be clear, like when we're talking about transitional forms, we're talking about forms between species, right? So
Yes.
I want to make that clear because, again, you'd be surprised how many things get lost in translation or whatever by the time that it gets down to like the comment section of this YouTube channel, where people
Gotcha.
will say, yeah, but I mean, like Darwin's finch beaks, for goodness sakes, or even like think about all the different dog breeds. Like breeders will select for certain traits and create dogs in a particular direction for particular reasons effectively and consistently. So, are you going to disagree with that, Casey? And so, how is what you're saying compatible with those obvious types of evolution, but at the same time, what are we seeing in the fossil? Like, what are we not seeing in the fossil record?
Great question. So I think the first thing you're going to get in the comments is people are going to start saying, what about this transitional form? Or what about that transitional form? And look, there are a lot of fossils out there, but let's talk about a couple of the most popular examples that are given for supposed transitional forms. One of them is Archaeopteryx, okay? Archaeopteryx is said to be a transitional form that shows that birds evolved from dinosaurs, okay? The problem with Archaeopteryx is that it had true feathers and it probably flew, okay? It had, people will say it was transitional because it had claws, a bony tail, and teeth. Now, there are some actually modern birds that have claws, so that really is not a very good example. But there are also many true birds from the fossil record that had teeth and a bony tail. So the idea that a bird could have claws, a teeth, and a bony tail is not at all unusual, okay? But what's interesting is that if Archaeopteryx is considered a true bird, the dinosaurs that are supposedly ancestral to Archaeopteryx, basically the dinosaurs from which birds supposedly evolved, they don't come in the fossil record until about 20 to 25 million years after Archaeopteryx already appears in the fossil record, okay? So you cannot be an ancestor of something that lived a long time before you, okay? So that means that these dinosaurs, they're called theropods, or various types of theropods. The theropod dinosaurs that are supposedly ancestral to birds and are supposed to be, transitional forms, et cetera, they really cannot be true direct transitional forms because they don't show up until many millions of years after we already see true birds in the fossil record. Let me give you another example.
Can I just ask, before you go to the, can I just say really quick, we're talking about like the layers of the fossil record, right? And like you're basically saying that if it's true that this bird came as a byproduct or through evolution from the dinosaur, it should be above it, right? In terms of like we're digging down, like it should be above the dinosaur, but instead you're saying it's below the dinosaur. I know you're talking about 25, but I'm thinking about just speaking to all sectors of my audience. Like that's the simplest way to put it, right?
That's the simplest way to put it. Yeah. Stratigraphically speaking is the way we would say it in geology. You should find the ancestor to be lower in the stratigraphy and the layers than the descendant. But instead, we find the reverse is often true. That means that this fossil that you're claiming as a transitional form cannot be ancestral to this thing that actually came many millions of years before it. Okay. That's what we're saying.
Cool.
Yeah. It's like saying that you were your grandpa, you were your own grandpa or something like that. It just doesn't work.
And then you were going on to an even more brilliant point. So sorry I interrupted you. I just wanted to make sure that there was no like linguistic red herring that took away from the main point there. So anyway, go for it.
Sure. So another example that people will give is whales. According to the standard evolutionary theory model, what they will say is that first you had, sea-dwelling organisms that walked on land. They evolved into amphibians and then reptiles. Some reptiles evolved into mammals. And then certain types of mammals actually evolved back into the sea. And those would be whales, okay, or other mammals as well, okay, that are aquatic. So according to standard evolutionary theory, whales are descended from land mammals, okay? And so some people will claim that there are actually fossils that document this evolutionary transition going from land mammals into fully aquatic whales. And there's only a few potential transitions there, but there are some. And, even if let's just grant for the sake of argument that they look like something that could be a land-based mammal, a terrestrial mammal that is evolving to have a more aquatic lifestyle and becoming more and more like a whale. Okay, let's just grant, for the sake of argument, that there are some fossils that look like that. I have some questions about these fossils, but let's grant that. I remember when I was in my undergrad, I took a course in geobiology that talked about how the evolution of whales was incredibly rapid. My professor actually talked about this. And what we see in the fossil record is that there's less than a 10 million year window to go from a fully terrestrial mammal to a fully aquatic whale. And in that time period, you have to evolve numerous complex adaptations that whales have that allow them to have that fully aquatic lifestyle. We're talking about evolving things like ball vertebrae, reducing the hind limbs, converting your forelimbs into flippers, having a reproductive system in males where you can have the testes inside the body, which requires this really complicated, like cooling antifreeze type system to keep the testes cool. A change in the musculature of the blowhole that allows, and the shape of the skull that allows them to breathe through a blowhole. All kinds of other biological and physiological changes, and numerous changes, basically. Okay, and the question is, could you do that in a mere 10 million years? Now, there was a study that may seem like a long time, but whales actually are kind of, in some ways, they're like a worst case scenario for evolution. They have relatively small population sizes. They have relatively long generation times. And as a large mammal, they're going to have a relatively low mutation rate. So you're going to need to get many mutations. And you're going to have to do that where you don't have many rolls of the dice, so to speak. Because again, small population size, long generation time, low mutation rate, which mammals tend to have. Okay. And so the problem really gets acute when we talk about the need for what we call coordinated mutations. This kind of goes back to where we were talking about proteins earlier, where you would need many amino acids to be in just the right order before you get any, stable functional protein fold to give you a functional protein. You would need a lot of information to be there. Basically, lots of information, lots of mutations have to be there in order. When I say mutations, I just mean, amino acids or nucleotides in the right place in order to get that information that's needed to get it to work right. Okay. The same thing would be true for these complex adaptations that whales have. Okay. And so there was a study that was published in the journal Genetics a number of years ago. Actually, this paper was published by some Cornell mathematicians who are population geneticists trying to refute Michael Behe, the pro-ID biochemist we talked about at the beginning of this conversation. Okay. And what they found is that if you have a population that has a relatively long generation time, low population size, that to get a trait that just requires 2 mutations before it gives you some advantage towards surviving reproduction, that could take over 200 million years just to get those 2 mutations showing up in one organism at the same time, in the same place at the same time, to get that trait that requires just 2 mutations before you get a selective advantage. What this means is that whale evolution is facing a serious mathematical problem, okay? If you need multiple mutations to be present before you get biological functionality in these complex adaptations, there's no way you're going to be able to evolve those traits in 10 million years, or maybe even less, depending upon how you interpret the whale cetacean fossil record, okay? So yes, even if we see these transitional forms, what we see with whale evolution, I believe, is actually a mathematical refutation of the possibility that standard blind evolutionary mechanisms caused that transition to happen, okay? That means that basically it wasn't neo-Darwinism. It was not. We don't have an evolutionary model to explain how whales evolved so quickly. And to me, the need for all that information to show up so rapidly implicates intelligent design was involved in the process. And by the way, intelligent design is not necessarily incompatible with common ancestry. I mean, I personally am a skeptic of common ancestry, but you could have common ancestry, organisms sharing common ancestors through intelligent design. That is one way to look at it. And so maybe that's what happened with whales. I don't know. But I do know this, that blind, unguided, standard evolutionary mechanisms cannot explain the rapidity with which whales appear in the fossil record from their supposed terrestrial land mammal ancestors. So you can cite those transitional forms all you want, but standard evolution is not going to explain it.
Yeah, I love the point that you're making there at the end as well about it's such a straw man, right? Like to believe in intelligent design means that you don't believe in any of this other stuff. It's all or nothing. It's black or white. And I love that you're basically saying like, no, there's just evidence that we have that is better explained by intelligent design than by undirected material processes. I always find it interesting when something like what you just presented is presented and the response to it is, I hear you. It does sound extremely mathematically improbable. And yet, here we are. So it must be true. With enough time and that same line of reasoning applies to the fine tuning of the universe, to the biological realm that you already touched on. It seems like at every level, I hear you, but here we are. Therefore, as improbable as it sounds like it is, as mathematically challenging as it sounds like it must have happened. We must have won the cosmic lottery 1,000 days in a row because here we are. Now, what is wrong with that response?
Well, I mean, it's kind of begging the question, right? You're assuming the truth of the evolutionary position before you even come to the table. And evolutionists do this all the time, okay? Let me give you one of my favorite examples, and this is from the field of biogeography. Basically, how to explain the distribution of organisms in space and time with common ancestry, okay? So according to standard evolutionary, model, there are old world monkeys who live in the old world, and there are new world monkeys who live in the new world, okay? And new world monkeys are supposed to have evolved from old world monkeys, okay? And you get so we're talking basically about monkeys in South America. This is the continent in the new world that has monkeys and monkey fossils. New world monkeys show up in the fossil record, and also I think molecular clocks indicate that according to evolutionary thinking, old world monkeys would have somehow colonized South America around 25 to 30 million years ago, maybe 35, something like that. But let's call it 30 million years ago, okay? The problem is that 30 million years ago, South America was an isolated island continent, okay? According to plate tectonics, 30 million years ago, South America was separated from Africa, where the old world monkeys come from. It was separated from Africa by literally hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers of open ocean, okay? So if you're an evolutionist, you have a serious problem right now, okay? Where do South American monkeys come from? How do you explain African monkeys colonizing South America when basically it was an isolated island continent at 30 million years ago? But, they're thinking exactly the way you just described. Well, South American monkeys are there, so it must have happened somehow, and intelligent design is just off the table. They will not even consider a non-evolutionary or mechanistic evolutionary approach to explaining anything.
You know what it could have been now that I think about it? It could have been a quantum fluctuation.
Well, it's something along those lines, okay? I mean, I think it's the biogeographical equivalent of a quantum fluctuation. They literally claim that African monkeys rafted across the Atlantic Ocean and colonized South America, okay? And it can't just be one monkey, right? Because one monkey gets there, it's dead. It's got to be multiple monkeys or maybe a pregnant monkey. And primates have very high metabolisms, okay? So you got to keep these things alive for many days with both food and water. I mean, am I saying it's absolutely impossible? Maybe not. But what I am saying is this. I'm saying that when you see evolutionary scientists resorting to these kinds of explanations to explain away data that does not fit their theory, their model is not working very well. I'm not saying it's absolutely impossible, but what I am saying is that we're seeing, and we see this with, many areas, the multiverse, okay? There's a vast, near infinite number of unobservable universes. That's how we explain fine tuning. Punctuate equilibrium. The reason we don't see transitional forms in the fossil record is because, the evolution just took place so rapidly and in such small populations that there was not any opportunities to leave these transitional forms. The origin of the universe, you get the fluctuation in the void, okay? We're now taking a step back, Brandon, and we're seeing this sort of macro view that over and over and over again, materialists have to resort to very speculative, and I would call improbable and highly unpersuasive models to be able to explain how they can retain their materialistic and or evolutionary model without it being refuted by the data. Whereas, the design, the information that we're seeing in the universe, information required at the origin of the universe, information required to explain the fine tuning, information required to explain these, complex animal forms that appear throughout the history of life, information that, is all throughout biology. This is pointing to the need for an intelligent cause. So I think that intelligent design is explaining the data, whereas materialism and evolution is trying to explain away the data. And you can see this in the kinds of outlandish explanations that they are forced to resort to over and over again. And even if those explanations are not technically impossible, or maybe there's a little bit of evidence for them here and there, and you can give them some, inkling of plausibility in some very small sense, you look at the pattern and you see that where they're forced to go is to some pretty not very good explanatory places. And this happens over and over again. And this tells you why materialism is not correct.
Well, not to harp on Alex O'Connor too much, but when I was talking with him, I did press him a little bit on this subject matter. And I basically asked him the question, is it more logical to believe that a book creates an author or that an author creates a book? And specifically, we were talking about the mind brain, that entire conversation, right? Like, does the mind does the brain beget the mind, or is there a mind that begets the brain? What is actually a more... And so it seems that if you're in a materialist position, it's a really tough place to be, because you basically have to say there was another type of a quantum fluctuation that somehow brain created mind. If you even accept that distinction, some people don't. Some people say there's no such thing as a mind, which is that's also really interesting and problematic for other reasons we could talk about. But the emergence of consciousness from matter is a bridge too far for me to cross personally. I cannot see a logical case for why. Let me put it this way: why it's more rational to believe that mind comes from matter than that mind comes from mind, or that matter comes from mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, if you want to frame the question very simply, is it mind before matter, or matter before mind? Okay, which is it? And I think that minds, again, our brains are the most incredibly complex arrangement of matter in the universe, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I'm aware. And incredible amounts of information are necessary to build your mind. Where does the information come from to build a human being's brain or mind? Okay, I should say brain, not mind.
I was going to say,
So let me say this: the whole mind-brain debate is not my area of expertise, and I'm probably going to screw it up if we go there too much. So I don't want to get into that too much, but I do think that the brain, which I believe our mind interfaces with, and I think that if Michael Egnor and Denise O'Leary have this fantastic new book out called The Immoral Mind. They talk about many lines of evidence that very nice.
Yes.
Brandon. So they talk about how there's all these lines of evidence that point to the mind being something distinct from the brain. Of course, they interact. And for me, I'm not an expert in any of this, but I do find near-death experiences to be pretty compelling. You have these examples where people are supposedly brain dead, and yet they're not only are they seeing things, they're seeing things like in the room, or in the room next door, where there's no way they could have known it was there unless their consciousness was something separate from their brain, from their bodies. And it seems like that is the most parsimonious explanation. And I watched Michael Egnor's debate with Michael Shermer on the Piers Morgan show about near-death experiences. And Michael Shermer's a very smart guy, a very nice guy. I have a lot of respect for him. But I have to say that I felt like when he, as a very well-respected atheist, was trying, he's a psychologist, by the way, I think that's his PhD, he was trying to explain near-death experiences. It was like watching somebody trying to grasp at straws. It's like, I'm sorry, man, but like, it's just not explaining the totality of the data that we see with near-death experiences. If you are a materialist, if I was a materialist, near-death experiences, when you really appreciate the data that's there, that people are seeing things that they could not have seen unless their mind was detached from their body, that would make me quake in my boots. And of course, folks are very committed to their paradigm, so it's hard for people to change their minds. We're all like that. That's just human nature, right? But I think the evidence for a mind being separate from the brain is pretty compelling. It's just not my area.
Yeah, well, no, and I wasn't trying to put you on the spot to defend it as much as just to say that, at least in my in my mind, it's another line of evidence that you have a choice to make. Are you going to say that matter begets mind somehow, that somehow there's this emergence of consciousness that takes place, and really, what is the evidence for that? I'd love to hear it, but and that's just one strand of evidence. But my point is, if you kind of go back to, and now I am going to be specific a little bit here, and I'm not putting you on the hook to be so, but I just want to say for myself, not just like alien intelligence, not just off-world intelligence, but if you go back to the God hypothesis, his ontological nature would explain human intelligence. If we're in his image and he is intelligent, he has every right and every power to be able to make us like him with intelligence, with consciousness. So it explains that. It actually explains that. It also explains if God is God, he can create the material world with its fine-tuning properties that you already talked about. That's a legitimate explanation, right? Like in the same way that if you look at a engineered computer program and then you go, oh, there's a engineer, like Bill Gates did it. Okay, that's a real explanation. Bill Gates architected the program. Great. Okay, I'm satisfied with that explanation. That makes sense. Rather than like, where did this computer program come from, right? And all I'm saying is at every single one of these levels, the biological machinery, the information within the genetic code, like at every single one of these levels, it seems like you are faced with a choice of either saying, I'm following this road all the way back and I'm hitting a dead end of some kind. Like the road is hitting a dead end and I'm having to stop and call something a brute fact. Well, it's just a brute fact that the material world exists. It's just a brute fact that somehow, we don't know how, but somehow consciousness emerged from matter. And on, right? And tell me if I'm like stretching this too far, but it's like you either have dozens of brute facts that are dead ends, or you find the through line, which ultimately takes you to God, who then, in a sense, is a dead end, but he's actually the conclusion of the matter. He's actually like the sufficient, necessary cause of all of these things, so that you don't need dozens of independent brute facts. Am I seeing that right, or how would you think about that?
Well, there's a lot of facts that point to the need for mind, and I think that science should continue. And the more science discovers, the more we're discovering that there is a need for a mind to be at the foundation of it all, to be able to account for it. And let's give another example. Okay, you mentioned molecular machines there. Okay, this is another area where the materialist explanation is what I would call an outlandish one. The way that they explain the origin of these irreducibly complex molecular machines is through an evolutionary model they call co-option. What is co-option? Co-option means that you basically take other parts in the cell. Okay, you take proteins that are doing other things, you retool them, reshape them, co-opt them to do an entirely new function, and then suddenly recombine them into an entirely new system, a new molecular machine to perform an entirely new function. Okay, and there's this quote from William Dembski where he says, okay, co-option. Well, what in our experience can take parts from other machines, retool, reconfigure them, and suddenly recombine them into a totally new machine with a totally new function? Well, in our experience, natural causes never do that. Okay, only intelligence can do that reshaping, that retooling, that recombining to build a new type of machine. So, again, across the board, fluctuations in voids, self-creating universes, something coming from nothing, a multiverse that we can't observe. You get co-option where, machines are being built by just stealing parts from other systems that randomly recombine into a totally new machine. Evolution that's hidden through punctual equilibrium in the fossil record, or what was the other one? Sorry, I'm forgetting now. But you get
we touched on the emergence of mind from matter without like really a mechanism for that. Like there's a faith gap there, no matter what, is my point. And everybody in all these areas is having to address what are you going to, I'm not saying that we're putting God into the gap. I'm saying that everybody is faced with a lack of evidence about how some of these things work. And then at the same time, I think you've done a phenomenal job of showing positive evidence for intelligent design, not there's gaps, therefore God. Like that's the other thing that will inevitably always come up in the comment section. There's
I appreciate, yeah.
which is
No, I
like so clearly not what you're really saying. So but go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate you said that, Brandon, because the God of the gaps, I didn't mean to cut you off, but this is such a crucial point. The God of the gaps sort of accusation or objection is so common that it is important just to make this really, really clear. The God of gaps objection says that you are making your conclusion based upon ignorance, based upon what we don't know, rather than what we do know. Intelligent design does not argue like that. Intelligent design says we are concluding a mind based upon what we do know. We do know from our experience that information requires an intelligent cause. It requires a mind. And guess what? Information is ubiquitous, not just in biology, but even in physics and cosmology, the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of new animal body plans and new types of organisms. All of this requires information. And in our experience, information comes only from a mind. So the case for design is not based upon what we don't know. It's based upon what we do know. It's not based upon gaps in our knowledge. It's based upon positive evidence that what we see in nature is the kind of information and complexity which in our experience always traces back to a mind or an intelligent agent. So I'll stop there. I shouldn't cut you off there. Sorry.
How would you respond if someone said, actually, no, I don't accept that. I would say that in every case that you're thinking of, what you're really seeing is just the material world being the material world.
Well, I would say, in science, we go off of what we see. Do we see material mechanisms producing the kind of information that we see in living systems, producing, entirely new protein folds, producing new body plans that we see appearing in the fossil record? Do we see this happening from material mechanisms? Do we have experience with, universes coming to existence on their own?
But what I'm saying is, what I'm saying is, if someone were to go that far, which I think some people would be willing to do, to say, hey, you brought up Mount Rushmore. Yeah, that's a great example of something material creating something else material.
Okay, so we are the material agent there,
right?
Look, what it is though is it's a mind. All right, mind could be material. Mind could also be immaterial. It's not just the fact that we're material. It's the fact that we are an intelligent agent. We can think with will and forethought and intentionality to build some highly complex system that really is full of CSI, a very, very rare scenario that matches a pattern. And so again, we can take it back to its mathematical essence. In our experience, CSI, complex and specified information, only traces back to a mind, only comes from intelligence. So if that's true, then we have to say, okay, well, if there was large amounts of complex and specified information necessary at the origin of life, then we have to invoke that. We have to explain that by invoking a mind. Now, Richard Dawkins wants it to be a material mind. Fine. Maybe it was an alien. Okay. That's what he thinks it was. But, I think that we can also say it could be a divine mind. That's also an option that's on the table. And then if you want to talk about all the incredible amounts of CSI that's found in the laws of nature to get those, constants and laws of physics that are fine-tuned for life to exist, there you can't explain it from aliens, okay? Because the alien is an entity that lives inside the universe. It is subject to the laws of nature. If that fine-tuning wasn't there, that alien couldn't exist. You need to explain the fine-tuning of the universe by referencing an intelligent mind that exists outside the universe. Same obviously goes for the origin of the universe itself with the Kalam cosmological argument. You need a first cause that is outside space and time to explain where the universe came from. So, some evidence for design in nature could be compatible with a divine mind or a natural, alien intelligence. But there are other instances of design where I think really the only game in town is an intelligent agent, especially with physics and cosmology, requires an intelligent agent outside the universe. Biology, sure, it could be a natural alien intelligence, or it could be a divine intelligence. I think it just depends on the case you're looking at.
It was interesting. You brought up Unbelievable earlier, the Unbelievable program, and there's an episode of that with Sir Roger Penrose talking with William Lane Craig. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but it is one of the most fascinating conversations I've ever seen, because basically Dr. Craig is able to help him understand that he is Roger Penrose is fully accepting that there is a immaterial dimension to reality, like the mental world that math is a part of, right? And so William Lane Craig is like, great, okay, so we're now closer to each other, and in that we're saying there's a dimension of reality that is physical, and there's a dimension of reality that is conceptual. Great. And then he basically just makes the point that that in and of itself, if properly teased out, points you in a particular direction. Like if there's two separate dimensions, that creates a whole other set of problems that like we've left materialism behind now, and now we're faced with an even deeper riddle of, well, then what are the laws of logic? What is mathematics? What are our minds? What is this conceptual realm? Some people talk about Platonism, but even that, I'll go with Platonism if you want to go with Platonism, or I'll go with Neoplatonism if you want to go. You're still talking about something that you have to explain, and you're not going to be able to do it using any of the scientific method in the traditional sense, meaning you're not observing something physical in order to make your explanation. And I think this is an amazing, like that conversation is if you guys haven't seen that, it's so worth watching, because you're like, oh, we're getting really close here. And I just thought he did a good job of showing how there's a crack in the door there, that if you walk all the way through it, you are right at the God hypothesis. You're right to God as the best source for these two dimensions of reality. Actually, hello, balloons. Yes, exactly. You're right there. So anyways, I just thought it was fascinating. And it reminds me a lot of the conversation that we're having right here, where it's like, again, I just see it as like all roads end up either ending in dead ends that are some brute fact that you just have to accept on faith, or you follow that road a step further and it takes you back to its source. And I think what you're saying about information is the clearest way to put that. Like everything we observe about information takes you back to an intelligence. If that's true, why would we not conclude that at the highest level?
Yeah, and you make great points about, what exactly is math. I'm not a mathematician. I'm also not a philosopher, so I'm probably not qualified to answer that question, but it raises that question. There was this famous paper written quite a while ago by this mathematician, Eugene Wigner, titled "The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics." And basically the question he's asking is, why does math work so well to explain what we see in the world around us? That's a really interesting question. And again, I don't know how a materialist is going to explain that.
Well, and the common misconception of that quote is that people will think, well, yeah, we're like the mathematician is just observing things as they are and then quantifying or describing that observation with the language of math. So of course math works. Like you're just giving language to the way that physics work or the way that the world works. What are we impressed about here? But the point that he's making there is, no, a mathematician will do math in his classroom without observing the way that the world really is. And he'll come up with a conclusion. Something will be on this side of the equal sign, and he'll go, that checks out according to math. And then he'll go, I wonder if that's the way that the real world is. Let's check it out. And then he'll apply that theorem to his observation and find, oh my word, I arrived at the right answer using just my mind. And the answer that I arrived at matches the way that the world really is. So the math is unreasonably effective. Like, why are humans capable of arriving at the right answer apart from observation of the material world? The mathematician arrives at the right answer just using his mental faculties and just following, the calculus or whatever. Like Newton got there and said, and now we use that, to go to the moon or whatever else. We use his conceptual conclusions to actually propel us through space. Like, that's amazing. That's the point of it, is that it's not just like math is not downstream from the material world and observation. It coexists alongside of it and can be understood apart from observation. That's the part when I understood that, I was like, oh, so there's a real symbiosis between the human mental world and whatever is the source of the way that the external world is.
Alan, we got to get you in here, man. I know that.
I'm
too much. I know you got something to say about this.
I'm not a mathematician nor as much of an expert as Casey, so I'm listening to what Casey has to say.
Well, no,
But
I mean,
one of the
yeah,
one of the fascinating things to me is just the discoverability of these things, right? Is so we can talk all day about, how evolution comes about, how mathematics works, but the fact that it's not only is it already existing regardless of if we perceive it or not, or if we discover it or not, but that there are actual things that can be explained that exist regardless of the human mind. And that's something that we can't explain away with materialism.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you guys this, just as I know, way over time. I appreciate every second of it. This has been awesome. But I'm curious if, as we kind of look ahead, and hopefully this conversation can play some small role in blazing this trail, but what do you see as some of the biggest challenges and or opportunities for intelligent design into the future?
sure. So for me, as basically the research director at Discovery Institute, our big push and goal that we've had for many years, but certainly we've really gotten a lot of, I think, success and funding for this in the last 10 years or so, is to build our research program. And we call it the ID 3.0 research program. You can find the homepage at discovery.org. And basically, we're funding scientists all around the world who are looking at evidence for intelligent design, looking at the specificity of information in proteins, looking at the irreducible complexity of molecular machines, looking at whether or not there's enough time in the fossil record to evolve complex organisms like whales, or whether intelligent design is implicated for the origin of that information, looking at the origin of fine tuning and to what extent are the laws of nature fine tuned, and many, many other topics. And so for me, this is super exciting because I think it's showing that intelligent design is a real potent scientific theory that can guide our research, and it can serve as a paradigm to guide research, not just in biology, but also in physics and cosmology. And so this to me is what I've always, going back to those days when I talked about as an undergraduate, learning about intelligent design, my dream was to always see intelligent design become a potent, fruitful, and vibrant active research program. And we are seeing that happening right now in the ID community. We just had a conference here in Seattle a couple of weeks ago where we had biologists and engineers at what we call our conference on engineering and living systems. And the idea is basically that engineers understand how to recognize design. They design things for a living. And what they're saying, working with biologists, is that when we apply an engineering method or engineering assumptions to biology, we can actually make better sense of how biology works by starting with the assumption that life was designed and engineered. And they're actually having great success in understanding things like the function for junk DNA, or why the vertebrate limb skeletal pattern is found reused in different organisms, or why glycolysis, this particular pathway that helps build energy molecules in our cells, why that is so ubiquitous across living organisms. It's not because of just universal common ancestry. It's because these systems are designed to be very efficient, and they're good, efficient design patterns to reuse over and over again in different organisms. So, we talk about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in science. One of my colleague, Dr. Brian Miller at Discovery Institute, he's reframed that as the unreasonable effectiveness of engineering in biology. Okay. Why does engineering work so well to study biology? There's a field called systems biology that basically assumes the living organisms have a top-down design where the parts, it's a hierarchical design, where the parts at the bottom levels are coordinated and organized to yield functions that work towards overarching goals. Okay. In all of our experience, top-down design, hierarchical design only comes from intelligence. This is the way that humans design technology. And yet this is exactly what we see throughout biology. The amazing things about the field of systems biology is that it is being practiced by biologists who don't even support intelligent design. They just use it because it works. Okay. In their minds, they think they're evolutionists, but they're actually applying design-based reasoning and design assumptions to better understand how biological systems operate. So the success of systems biology, in my view, actually points to the fact, again, that life was designed. So we have biologists in our research program who are using systems biology to study living systems and finding success in doing that. Okay. So for me, as sort of, functionally the research director at Discovery Institute, I'm really excited about the future. Another area where I'm really excited, Brandon, is our summer seminar, where we have students that are coming through and learning about ID from top scientists and scholars in the field. In fact, Alan was just at our summer seminar this year.
Yeah,
and
it was
basically
awesome.
it was a lot of fun. We did some good hikes together, Alan, didn't we?
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. But we are training up the next generation of ID-friendly students. These are often students who are graduate students planning to get their PhDs in the sciences, and then they want to go and contribute to ID research. In fact, a number of the researchers in our community are summer seminar graduates who now got their PhDs, and they are now faculty doing research for intelligent design. And so I'm very, very, I guess, optimistic about the future of intelligent design, seeing that we have such a large number of up and coming graduate students and young faculty who are supportive of ID. We go over the Dover ruling. They understand why a lot of the myths about ID that have been promoted in, the world are just not correct. They know what ID really is because they've read the books. They've heard about it from the ID scientists doing the research, and they know that ID is a valid scientific theory, and they're excited about growing this theory in their own careers. So I am super, super optimistic and excited about where ID is going to go in the coming years.
That's fantastic. Can I just make one last? We're concluding here. This is part of the conclusion, but because you brought up junk DNA and because you brought up the idea of myths being popularized, that really brings to my mind something I think is very important within this entire conversation, which is that things will be stated very loudly at a certain point in time. For example, junk DNA totally works against intelligent design. If there's an intelligent designer, why is there all this junk DNA? And I think probably everyone listening to this has heard that. But what I think probably way less people are familiar with is some of the more recent discoveries around junk DNA. Those are said quietly, but do you kind of follow what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I think this is how it goes: is there'll be this loud proclamation of something, and then a really, really quiet walking it back, or a disclaimer, or a little footnote put at the end of something. And I think that the way that plays out impacts the way that the public thinks about all of this. So if you can maybe use junk DNA as just a single case study to kind of show this is the blueprint or something. And again, I'm not necessarily implying motive, but this is how it seems to go. And I think it's just really important for people to understand that in order to see, well, then what else am I aware of and what else am I not aware of in terms of where the science actually stands today.
I'm so glad you brought up junk DNA, Brandon. This is kind of like another major argument that we haven't even, there's so much to talk about. We haven't talked about this yet. So junk DNA is the idea that the vast majority of our genome basically is functionally useless. It's not doing anything for your bodies. It's basically, according to this idea, the result of millions of years of unguided random mutations producing evolutionary debris in your genome that is there for no purpose other than maybe just to make, selfish DNA, making copies of itself, but it's not actually doing anything to help you survive. And I remember hearing this argument way back when I was an undergraduate at that idea club I mentioned earlier at UC San Diego. We would hear this argument. This is in the late 90s, early 2000s. People would say, well, if our genome is actually designed, why is so much of it junk DNA? And my response would be, this is back in the, again, late 90s, early 2000s. This is before even we had, or scientists had completed the Human Genome Project, okay? So there was still a lot that we did not know about the human genome. And my response would always be, well, you don't actually know that the vast majority of the genome is junk DNA, okay? You're assuming that under your evolutionary model, but you don't actually know that. This is just an outgrowth of your evolutionary paradigm. Why don't we take more of a cautious and careful approach? I used to call it the wait and see approach, and see what actually happens, because there's so much we don't know about the genome if this junk DNA turns out to be functional. Well, about a year ago, I did a debate on the Non Sequitur channel with a Rutgers University evolutionary biologist named Daniel Stern Cardinale. He has the Creation Myths YouTube channel, and I really appreciated his willingness to do a debate. We debated the question of, is the genome largely junk DNA? And what I said in that debate is that, look, I've been watching this issue, this question, since I was an undergraduate. And I remember when we didn't know much about the genome, but we have learned so much since then that there has been a legitimate paradigm shift in the scientific community. And the big turning point for junk DNA happened in 2012 when a huge consortium of hundreds of international biologists called the ENCODE Project published a series of papers with the lead paper in Nature that basically found that over 80% of our genome shows evidence of biochemical functionality. Okay. This was a huge breakthrough. And at that time, I think that the journal Science printed a headline that said something along the lines of, ENCODE writes the eulogy for junk DNA, okay, or sounds the death knell for junk DNA. So this idea really overturned, this project really put a huge dent in the idea of junk DNA. Here's another example. Francis Collins, who is a well-known theistic evolutionist, also a Christian, okay, not at all questioning his Christian commitment. He was also head of the Human Genome Project, okay? If you read his 2006 book, The Language of God, he says that 45% of the human genome, his exact words are, it is flotsam and jetsam. What is flotsam and jetsam? That basically is trash that is floating in the ocean, okay? And this reflects, he basically takes a standard evolutionary view. And again, I'm not questioning his Christian commitment. This is his view, okay? Well, fast forward to 2015, where he's giving a talk, and he basically says, this is after ENCODE came out. He says, junk DNA, we don't use that term anymore. In fact, it reflected our hubris of thinking that, the vast majority of the genome is functional. Now, you still see people who are defending junk DNA today. And I kind of compare them to kind of like the holdouts after, World War II was over, living in caves, thinking that, this war was still going. But I think by and large, the scientific community has bypassed and has gone beyond and overturned the idea of junk DNA. In fact, there was an article in the journal Genome Biology and Evolution in 2021, which said the days of junk DNA are over. There was a paper in the journal Bioessays in 2023, which says that basically it used the phraseology of there having been a Kuhnian paradigm shift away from the idea of junk DNA. So we have seen a legitimate scientific revolution where now I think this typical view of biologists is that the vast majority of our genome is in fact functional. In fact, I have a friend who studies RNA at an Ivy League school. I'm not going to say where, but I asked this person, is the typical view in the scientific community today, is if it's being transcribed into RNA, does that mean it's probably got a function? And this person said, yes, that is the standard view in biology today, that the vast majority of the genome is in fact functional. So this topic of junk DNA, Brandon, represents what I would call a testable prediction that intelligent design put out there, that junk DNA would turn out to be functional. In fact, I need to make this point. There were ID theorists going back to the mid to late 1990s, like William Dembski, Forrest Mims, and others, who were specifically predicting that junk DNA would turn out to be functional. And this was before we knew about the function for junk DNA. They made this testable prediction based upon their ID view. And why did they make this prediction? Well, it's very simple. Intelligent design is all about what in our experience is produced when intelligent agents act, right? It's a positive argument. And in our experience, when intelligent agents act, they produce things that have function, that have a purpose. They do things for a reason. And so based upon that, many ID theorists over the years predicted that we would find function for junk DNA. This was long before ENCODE came out or any of these, now literally thousands of papers came out finding function for junk DNA. So this represents a spectacularly fulfilled positive prediction of intelligent design. And it also represents an example where the evolutionary model made a prediction that turned out to be very, very badly wrong. In fact, it probably hindered our progress of understanding science. There was an article in the journal Science a while back that said that the term junk DNA repelled, they used the word repelled researchers from studying non-coding or junk DNA, okay? And so if ID had been the paradigm guiding biology, I think we would have made progress in understanding this very, strange, enigmatic parts of the genome much, much more rapidly. We now know that junk DNA performs a myriad of functions. The main one is regulating gene expression, but it does many other functions as well. Junk DNA is vital for an organism, and it is not the case that the vast majority of our genome is just useless genetic junk.
Yeah, it's funny because on this channel, I'll make a title for a video, something like "New Scientific Discoveries Are Pointing Towards God." And people will say, that's clickbait. What are you talking about? No way, man. But what I really mean is, let's step back for a second and imagine that Watson and Crick didn't unlock what they unlocked.
Mhm.
I mean, just imagine that. Imagine they look there and they go, oh, we don't see any specified complex information in the cell. We just see just a globule, like what Darwin said. Okay, well that would be a totally different direction for science to go, right? Or imagine, they look at like we were talking about, all the cosmological, like the origins of the universe, and imagine there's not the red shift, there's not the background radiation. Imagine all these things. We look, man, it looks like the universe is just static. It's just a steady, maybe probably eternal thing, right? Like there's no second law of thermodynamics. Man, this is crazy. It looks like the universe just is in this static state. Wow. And we could go through everything that we've covered over the last couple hours and just imagine if the evidence was pointing in a different direction. And I'm using that as a thought experiment to try to help someone understand that the more that we're progressing in terms of our knowledge of how the world works, the more clear it is that things are designed, that there is information at the core of reality itself. And I think that's an important thing. Like we just kind of assume, oh yeah, well, we've got DNA and we've got the universe going back to a beginning. We've got mind emerging from matter. Like and it's like, speaking of hubris, it's like, it's a really kind of like audacious thing to just assume like, oh yeah, this is all how it is. And because it is how it is, it's all explained materially. It's like, whoa, let's just recognize the fact that the more that we learn, the stronger the case for intelligent design is becoming.
Totally agree. Meaning junk DNA is literally finding that the genome contained far more functional information than we previously thought. It's not just the 2 to 3% that encodes proteins, but it's far more of the genome that previously was thought to be junk. We now know is functionally important. So I totally agree with you, Brandon.
I don't even know where else to go from here, what else to say, except for thanks for your time, both of you guys. Is there anything else that we should add on or pick up, or is this as good of a jumping off point as any other?
There's so much more we could talk about. I want to make sure that Alan gets a chance to talk about the science dilemma, which is a great project he's working on.
Yeah, we could dive in. I don't know if you want to lead it with a question, so I'm not jumping in and just throwing myself in there.
What is the science dilemma?
Yeah, so we created the science dilemma because we believe that so many students aren't being taught the full truth. They're not being given the opportunity to hear this side of the story, right? Everybody is being told, hey, the experts, like you said earlier, the general consensus is that neo-Darwinism is science, and it is how we got here. That's the origin of life, and that's just it. If you don't believe that, then you're a dunce, and you're not going to have any scientific career if you want to get into the sciences. And so we don't believe that that's the case, and we don't believe that that's fair to people in general, whether they're adults or students. So we created the science dilemma to provide that platform, both for the scientists to have their opportunity to get in front of more students and for families to be educated on what everyday people believe, what their students are going to be, what their kids are going to be approached with when they go to university or in the workplace. And then maybe, so we have 3 arguments that we dive into. So coding the DNA, the fossil record, and then molecular machines. And so those 3 simple arguments for students to understand, but still complex enough that if you listen to Casey or any of the scientists talk about it, they could hold their own weight in a college classroom.
And Alan, that's just season 1. I mean, you have more seasons planned of the science dilemma. Is that right? Or
oh yeah, we're definitely wanting to dive more into even more conversations, both on the Apollo. Brandon, I'd love to get your input. Maybe we could talk off camera sometime and discuss some of the next series that we're gonna do, because we just want to equip students, man. We want to make sure that when people are like graduating and going off to college or going into the workforce and into the world, we want to equip Christian families, with all this stuff. And so many families don't feel like they and aren't being equipped to be able to teach their kids what is a positive argument for God being our creator, and what are the implications on the rest of your life if you don't find purpose in God, and purpose in your own creation. And so, yeah, we just believe that this is pivotal for every single person to understand. And that's why we created the science dilemma.
I love that, man. Yeah, I'll tell you. I mean, I want to say this while we're on air, because I want people to be aware of this in case I'm right. I think that the secret sauce for the next decade is going to be the cross aisle conversations. I
Yeah.
think I've seen enough examples of that. Stephen Meyer talking to Michael Shermer on Brian Callen's podcast. And at the end of that conversation, you're just like, that was, I don't know if you guys saw that, but it's like that was a pretty good one. And I just think we need more of that, because it's one thing for someone to listen to this and go, man, Dr. Luskin is really smart and he made some really good points. And then what's the next video? Oh, click. Oh, whoever you would consider to be, the other perspective, they listen at, oh, he sounded really smart too. Well, I guess I'm just confused, but because the majority of science are neo-Darwin, I guess I'm neo-Darwin. And then that's how it ends. And I just think, let's, like how I was saying earlier, let's have a meeting of the minds, and let's have cross-aisle conversations, and let's let the truth point to wherever it does. Right. And so I think that's going to be the key, is getting out of kind of the Christian silo or the intelligent design silo, and to where people are like, I don't even want to listen to that video. But all of a sudden, if it's so-and-so and Dr. Luskin together, you've just pulled in that whole other audience. And now you've actually got the listening ear of the people who think that you're crazy for believing what you believe, or for the, maybe they think it's all presuppositional. Maybe they don't actually know that you have lines of evidence, and maybe they'll get a chance to hear those because you're talking to the guy that they like. So I think that's the key.
That's so true. And they're listening to the way that the guy they like responds to it. And so they're starting to see if he starts fumbling or not, or if he's respectful, regardless of how the conversation goes.
Yeah.
It's modeling it for them.
And I think it's better for both sides. Cause like, let's say that let's say that there's an objection that's raised that hasn't been thought about. Well, regardless of what happens in that moment, it'll be thought about next time. And that's good.
Yep. It's like even with Alex O'Connor, people, I think Ruslan said it to Alex O'Connor when at the Bless God Summit, he's done a lot for the Christian community, and the fact that the Christian community has to rebut his statements. So then when we invite those conversations, they just make us better.
Yep.
I 100% agree. And, and we live in a very divided society. People talk about, civility is going down. Everybody's becoming extremist or whatever, being radicalized. The antidote to that is conversation with folks who don't think exactly the same way you do. Yep. This is why I started the Idea Club back in the day, was because I wanted to have friendly conversations with people, and we could interact, learn from each other, and hopefully everybody walks away closer to the truth, whatever you believe. So couldn't agree with you more, Brandon. This is super important. The internet can be a pretty ruthless place. There's a lot of name calling. There are some very toxic voices out there who are really spreading a lot of just hate, name calling. And I think that the way around that is to have serious, friendly conversations. I know what that's like. I've been a victim of some of those attacks. And I just think that the way we need to have more dialogue rather than people just calling other people names, and even today, like when you're not in a dialogue, and we're probably all in agreement, we're also trying to take this conversation in a civil direction. We might disagree with folks, but we're not saying that they're evil or morally corrupt or dishonest or liars. We disagree with them, but they're not crazy. They're rational people who are trying to cope with evidence within their worldview. We all face these questions. And even if I disagree with folks, I have respect for the folks that think differently than me do. And that's what makes the conversation so much fun. So yeah, great, Brandon. Really appreciate your civil approach. This is what we need more of. And I couldn't agree with you more. And by the way, this is something I really like about Alan and the Science Dilemma. He goes out and interviews people, kind of like man on the street interviews, and just gets the thoughts of like normal folks. What do you think about evolution and intelligent design? And gets their perspective and brings them into the conversations, things they might not think about. Alan, you're such a great interviewer. I love your man on the street interviews that you do.
Thank you. Well,
yeah,
Brandon,
I'll put that in the description, by the way, so people can check out your project, Alan. And then also, Casey, what's the best way for people to find more of you or to connect with you? What can we pitch to for you?
Well, Discovery Institute's website is discovery.org. My personal website is caseyluskin.com. And our newly rebranded news site is scienceandculture.com. Used to be evolutionnews.org. It's been one of the main evolution and ID, information websites for 2 decades now, going back to like 2004, but it's now been rebranded as scienceandculture.com. It's a great website. Go check it out.
Awesome. Any last thoughts? I think I slightly cut off someone a second ago.
I was just saying, thank you so much for the interview, and just within the process of interviewing, instead of keeping it all like positive, you're still asking the hard questions of like, hey, if somebody has a different perspective, Casey, how would you respond to this? So I appreciate that you're just being you're integral with how you're interviewing versus just trying to keep it in the silo. So
I think subconsciously I'm trying to facilitate that multi-layer dialogue that I really want to see with a representative of the other side. And so I think I'm trying to channel the objections that I am getting from like the comment section, and I'm trying to put those in front of someone like Dr. Luskin to try to almost get that, to try to go deeper than just the first claim that's made. Like, well, what's the alternative? And then what's the response to the alternative? And
I love it.
yeah. So cool. But yeah, appreciate it, you guys. This was awesome. Thanks for the
Brandon.
hours.
We've been here for almost 4. Thank you so much, Brandon. I would love to do more of those cross viewpoint conversations. And I think a lot of folks in the ID camp, I'm not just speaking for myself here, I'm speaking for pretty much everybody I know. We love to do cross viewpoint conversations. So, thank you for your openness to doing that. I really respect that. And thanks for this conversation today. A lot of fun.